Hey kids, welcome back to On Stage, Off Stage. I'm your host, George Sapio, and this is episode 113, January 2019. Happy New Year, kids. I hope 2019 is a hell of a lot better than 2018 was. Okay, so we're kicking off with a double shot. We have Travis Russ, Artistic Director of New York City's Life Jacket Theater, and Anthony Dvarskas, a Life Jacket creative collaborator and the author of the HowlRound.com article, Creating Theater from Reality, the Challenge of Documentary Theater. Documentary theater is a new subject for On Stage, Off Stage. Normally, playwrights work to make their characters as real as possible while maintaining a certain unity in their tactics, reactions, and choices. In a large sense, we create from inspiration, fashion our work from whole cloth, and remain true to the world that we invent. Documentary theater deals with actual persons, individual realities that come, in a large sense, pre-written. So we decided to kick off with a very obvious question. How do you make real people come to life on stage, real people now, all right, and maintain the truth of their journey while also keeping the audience engaged? Is there a tipping point between making them interesting or mining their interests? Because your ultimate goal here is to keep the audience wide-eyed and, fully attentive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I keep reminding the company that we're not journalists, we're theater artists. And as theater artists, we're interested in telling a compelling and engaging story. We really want to make sure that characters have a true arc, have a true compelling journey that audiences can connect to and follow and have an emotional attachment to. Journalists are responsible for just reporting the facts and letting the audience draw their own conclusion. So it's a tricky balance. I mean, I'm an academic as well in another part of my life, and so I love sort of pulling back the curtain and revealing our process and putting that on stage. But we also want the characters to live and breathe and be in that same space with the audience. Anthony, do you have any? What was your experience in working on the show?
Yeah, I think Anthony. I think that it's a great question. I think the challenge is that to find the pieces of people's stories that are really the interesting things that will jump out for an audience without, George, I think you were getting at this, without kind of going over the tipping point of turning it into using it just for, dramatic purposes or making it seem unreal or things like that. And I think that's kind of the exciting part of it, is that there's a lot of things we all do in our day-to-day existence that actually isn't very interesting. And so one of the things we did as part of the interview process is you spend time with people and you're with them on interesting times of the day and not interesting times. And you're hearing about their lives and the interesting parts of their lives and the parts that, are just kind of the experience that we all have exactly the same. And it's just a matter of waiting to hear them, waiting for the point where they become comfortable enough to share those parts of their stories that are unique and have really defined them. I mean, because that's really, I think, what fiction writers do, is they try to pull out the experiences that make their characters unique. With us, those experiences are there. They're just not, since we're not creating them, we're waiting for someone to reveal them to ourselves, right? To us as we're talking with them. And it's a matter of just being attuned to that and really listening to people as we're interviewing them, I think.
Gotcha. Somebody once said it's a good theater is life without the boring bits.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's true. And another quotation is, a great story happens to the person who can tell a great story. And to sort of backtrack a little bit in terms of our process for even the most recent show, America is Hard to See. We after all the interviews were done, we had over 5,000 pages of interview transcripts.
Wow.
And
how many of you were actually doing the interviews?
We had a team of only 3 people doing about 75 interviews. But it actually worked in our favor because it's already a very small, tight-knit community. And so it was kind of nice to have a small team connect and build relationships with those folks. As Anthony mentioned, I mean, especially that was a very sensitive subject matter that we were dealing with. So it really helped that the community grew to know us, and we were able to build close, tight-knit relationships with them. So when we came back, we had over 5,000 pages of transcripts, and then I expanded the team, and so I had everyone on the team read every page of every interview, and individually we highlighted the most interesting parts. And I kind of say, what parts are most stage-worthy? And then I had us put sort of those transcripts to the side, and of course I ended up combining all of those transcripts. But I had just folks mention, just from memory, which parts resonated with them.
Okay.
And it was funny, like their instinct was to try to go back and want to manually comb through the interviews. And I said, no. If it stuck with you, it's going to stick with our audience. And so we just brainstormed, just did a huge brain dump as to what stuck out to you as you were reading the interviews. And then what we did is we actually just pulled those bits and put them in a very rough script that was several hundred pages, and we just read it aloud. And we asked those folks what resonated with you from those bits, and then we just kept those, and we kept fleshing out. So we lost several characters over the journey.
Okay, I'm going to stop you here for a second. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because I want to get some background on what it is. You're talking about the project, but my audience doesn't know what the project is yet.
Sure.
It's called America is Hard to See, and it's a documentary piece. Please tell me about who your subjects are and what you went through to get through to them.
Sure. So this is Travis. You're right. The title is America's Hard to See, and it had an off-Broadway premiere in this past January, so almost a year ago. And several years before that, the company went to a small town called Pahokee, Florida. It's about an hour and a half inland from West Palm Beach. And we interviewed folks who were sex offenders who were living in this small town, and they lived in this village because it wasn't close to really anything. No parks, no bus stops, no playgrounds, nowhere where children could congregate.
No. Why were they there? Why would so many sex offenders go to one particular town?
Yeah, they actually, these men, about 75 of them, lived outside the city limits of Pahokee, Florida. They lived in the middle, truly the middle of a sugarcane field. And these houses were built back in the 60s for migrant workers who would harvest the sugarcane fields by hand. But machines came in, took away the jobs, and so these houses were abandoned. And because the residency laws are so strict in the state of Florida, they really had no other choice but to live in the middle of nowhere. A lot of men who are convicted sex offenders who are released from prison, they often live under bridges because that, again, isn't close to, that fits the requirement. It certainly isn't acceptable housing, but it's where they can live, not where they want to live. And so we spent several months, and actually we over the span of several years, we followed their lives as they tried to rebuild them and tried to live as much as they could in a normal life. And so this play was based on those transcripts. We had a composer come in and build songs based out of their transcripts. And so she would use their actual words and tell their story in song. And then we infused a number of traditional Methodist hymns because one of the characters in the play is a pastor from a local church, and she is a rabble-rouser. And she decided to reach out to these men and invite them into her church. And, of course, that caused a lot of conflict. And so this play is really about not necessarily their crimes, but their challenge to move forward and build a new life for themselves, and it's really testing the limits of forgiveness as human beings. So faith plays a critical role in the show.
Wow, that's quite a project. How long did this project take from inception to opening night?
3.5 years, which is actually not that long. But it was quite a daunting task. It's the most difficult project I've ever worked on. And the show is actually going to go to Edinburgh for the festival this coming August. So we're excited to share it with an international audience.
That should be interesting. I want to get a little bit of background on both of you. Anthony, tell me about your theatrical history.
So I actually, my theatrical history is more in the playwriting area, where I work fiction, actually. So writing plays, and I've been working on that for a couple of years. And then as I've been doing that, been working on some dramaturgy with Travis and Life Jacket. And so I was excited to be able to be engaged in the research work that was going on in this, even though it wasn't, there was no fictional writing involved. There were opportunities to kind of explore characters that are real, and see how their stories kind of would meld together in creating an arc overall. And I've also done some work outside of this realm, also based kind of on real events, I guess, working with a group called Superhero Clubhouse, and they look at the intersection of environment and theater and how you might use theater to convey messages about the environment in a way that basic scientific facts and such might not connect with an audience, but maybe theater is another way of doing that. So
seems like you're both big on social relevance in theater.
That's an understatement. I'm really fascinated with folks who live on the margins, either by choice or by force, and really the outsiders of society.
What's your academic background? You mentioned before that you were in academics.
Sure. So it's pretty eclectic, which is probably what you're also picking up on. This is Travis, and I used to be heavily involved in performance studies and speech and debate, where we would take literature and perform it and add social commentary to the literature we were performing. And then now I teach everything from performance to storytelling to teaching entrepreneurs how to pitch their ideas and frame a cogent narrative about their ideas.
That sounds dense.
Well, the challenge is, how do you take something that's very highly theoretical and make it accessible to an audience? And how do you organize a compelling story when it might be very fragmented and might be very hard to follow? That's what really thrills me as an artist.
Sounds like you like big projects.
That's also an understatement, yes. Mm-hmm.
Anthony, I see, Anthony, that you're an academic writer in the field of environmental economics, which that sentence has an awful lot of syllables in it. But how does your experience with environmental economics and these cold, hard, non-negotiable facts that you have to deal with, how does that work into your playwriting? Do you find yourself limited by the material, or do you find it somehow enlightening?
Oh, actually, I've always found it enlightening, actually, to go to a world where maybe there's a little more looseness, although I guess we have looseness with facts, but where there's more looseness with facts in writing. And I mean, what's interesting about like environmental economics in that world and science in general, right, is the creativity that's in the process of interpreting the various facts that are laid out before you, right? Because you can reach different conclusions with a set of facts and what they might mean. Now there are some conclusions that are, better supported than others, but so it is this puzzling process that's involved in environmental economics and any science, I think, which actually translated pretty pretty well to these kind of theater based on real events, right? Because you're taking kind of these pieces of what's real and what people tell you and what they don't tell you, right? And so there's a part of what they don't tell you. So you're trying to create what they mean, what is the overall meaning of what you're seeing based on the pieces of what they're showing you, which are, their interpretations of facts, and translating that into something that hopefully is authentic and real and some kind of more universal truth, I guess. But
sounds like
so there's overlap for sure.
Yeah,
but,
sounds like you're filling in the missing pieces of a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, that's how I kind of think of it a lot of times. Yeah, but I will say, like, when I do fictional playwriting, it definitely is more of, it feels like a little bit of a release from economics and environmental stuff in a way, because you can make up a world where certain things do or don't exist, right?
Yeah. But you have to remain true to that world. There has to be that essence of unity within whatever it is that you've created.
Yep, exactly.
This is Travis, and I just want to chime in on one thing. I think what's also exciting about, I don't know if you want to call it investigative theater or docu-theater or docudrama, but competing facts and competing perspectives and competing stories are actually quite thrilling from a dramatic perspective. And so I know when I first start on a play, I really want to create a very tight-knit, very clear narrative and journey for the audience to follow. But every time I try to do that, the facts get in the way and they start rubbing up and clashing with each other. And instead of fighting that, I've learned to try to embrace it. And I have to catch myself every single project. What I think is a problem is actually inherent drama in the play. And that's exciting. So you don't want to fix that problem. You actually want to highlight that problem. Yeah. So, for example, with America's Hard to See, some of our interviewees, particularly some of the folks who got out of prison, they would tell one version of their story. But then when we compared it to the story that was told during their trial, it sometimes conflicted, and sometimes very important facts didn't necessarily align from one story to the next. And instead of prioritizing, like, say, a journalist would do, to say, here's what we have sussed out as being the facts of the case, we actually just presented both and let the audience choose which to feel is more truthful. But that's theatrically very exciting, and I don't feel an onus to promote a particular agenda in a show.
Yeah, it sounds like a tricky loophole to get around. I'm reminded of a small lyric by the late Warren Zevon, who said, "If I could only get my record clean, I'd be a genius." And I think that rings true for many of us. But I want to lead back into, thank you for going there, lead back into America is Hard to See. Subject matter, we're talking with sex offenders and a community of sex offenders. Especially these days, that is a term that brings up a visceral response. How did you work your way into this community? How did you build a trust? And did you have any personal issues to get past when dealing with these folks?
Wow, there are a lot of questions there.
Yes, there are. Sorry about that. I'll remind you as we go along.
But that's also exciting, too, is that there are so many issues wrapped up into this one subject. And I think it's important to, this is Travis, by the way, I think it's important to note that when we stumbled upon this topic, we didn't think, oh, yes, this is the next show for LightJack. This is the one we are going to do. It's intriguing, but I'm not going to do that show. But the second that came out of my mouth or entered my head, I thought, oh, that's the show you have to do. You have to do the one that you don't want to do, but it's theatrically interesting, and caused me a lot of, I have started calling it emotional confusion, and that's actually the experience I want my audience to go through, is you start feeling for these folks, and then you start realizing, or remembering what they did and that they hurt another human being, but yet they're trying to rebuild their lives, and they're actually building relationships with people you care about in the play because they're actually human beings, and they're trying to move forward and versus living in the past. Yeah, is it a complicated topic? Yes. Is it a worthwhile topic? Yes, because this does exist, and ignoring it doesn't really do anybody any good. And until we address this topic head on, we can't solve it. It's always existed. The Greeks talked about it. They dealt with very controversial issues, and they chose theater as an interesting forum to have these very public discussions. And we sort of do an homage to Greek theater in the show, where several concepts and conceits in the staging and the construction of how the story unfolds. But the goal is to begin the conversation. It's not really even a debate. It's telling these people's stories and allowing our audience to begin the conversation. And in fact, we did about 7 talkbacks throughout the run of the show and the off-Broadway version in New York City. And most of the audience stayed, and I rarely see that happening. Usually it's a handful of people.
Yeah, that doesn't happen a lot with talkbacks.
No, 80 to 90% of our audience stayed and wanted to engage in a conversation. We had to kick people out of the lobby because we were closing the theater after the talkback.
Yeah. What was the audience response to this sort of material?
People wanted to come. We were almost sold out every night. Really engaged audiences. And often people would chase me down in the lobby, and they would talk about how they're what the phrase that I had already mentioned was emotional confusion. They would echo that back to me. It's a difficult journey. It's a difficult piece to perform. It's a difficult piece to watch. A lot of the folks that we interviewed from Florida actually flew up to New York and saw themselves reflected back to them on stage. That was a unique process as well.
What was the response to that?
Anthony, do you want to talk a little bit about, that was actually our first public performance. Anthony, do you want to talk about what it was like to watch people watch themselves on stage? Or were you there for that first night? I don't remember.
I was not there for that first evening, I don't believe. But I was there. They came up subsequent times. And I think what was really exciting was, so to back up one little bit, I think one of the things, right, that we are trying to do is, we talked about, finding the interesting pieces of all of these stories for theatrical purposes, but we want to make sure these are accurate reflections of the people they're representing, which is, this challenge that we have, that it's not hyperbole, et cetera, et cetera. So what was really exciting was to hear them say that they saw each other, right, in those characters, right, that they knew that, like, we would hear laughter in the audience from the people who were coming up from Florida, because they said, they were like, that is so how that person acts, right, because it really embodied them. And I think for some, and Travis, maybe you have some additional stuff to say on this, I think for some of them, actually, they hadn't necessarily thought about maybe some of the things they said and the way they come out, and it made them reflect a little bit more about why they may have reacted in a certain way and why they thought a certain way about something at a time. And some of them really just had emotional reactions to it. There were tears, as you might expect, as people heard their own stories in some cases, or the stories of people they had lived with in the community, told from their own perspective. So it was a really interesting and strange thing. And honestly, it was pretty, Travis, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think for the research team and those involved in it, it was a little nerve-wracking thinking that these folks are in the audience and watching this, because they could have said, this is entirely this is completely untrue. That's not the way we are, but they didn't, and that made us feel like that we succeeded, right, in capturing things and also making it dramatically interesting at the same time.
Yeah, I was. This is Travis. I was terrified that I think most of the people we interviewed, some were not able to travel outside the state of Florida, weren't able to travel outside of the county they lived in Florida. But some folks were off probation, so they were able to see themselves in the show. I was terrified. Of course, I didn't tell my cast that the people that they were playing in the show were in the audience that night.
Yeah, surprise.
They were. Right. Well, I did announce it after the show at the curtain call, and both the cast and the audience were equally surprised. And the cast had not met these people, so it's not like they looked out and they were able to spot them by face.
Yeah.
I purposely allowed the cast to develop, and this goes back to your actually opening question of translating fact into theatrical life. I let the cast just use the script and build their own versions of the characters that they just instinctually knew to create. I didn't have them listen to the interview transcripts. I didn't have them look at pictures of the real people, didn't have them watch interviews. They just use their own humanity and their own empathy to devise their own versions of these real people.
Right. I think that's a great point.
But it was...
These weren't supposed to be impersonations, so to speak. They were something other than that. So, and
I was... as we were developing the script, I was working, with Anthony and with some other researchers, and along with the composer Priscilla Holbrook, who did a fabulous job. Folks can go to our website and listen to they can watch some of the videos that include some of the music that Priscilla wrote and reorchestrated. I was telling Priscilla, I was like, I don't know, I feel really uncomfortable putting these contrasting facts from their legal cases alongside their personal stories, because these people, we've developed relationships with these people, but I knew I had a responsibility as an artist to tell the contrasting stories. And Priscilla said, you know what, Travis, if you are honest and you tell an honest story and you craft a truthful portrait of these people and their journeys, they are going to find the value in the show, and they're going to find that a more complete and honest portrait of them and their story. And she was 100% right. The things that I kind of cringed at in crafting the script actually were the most vulnerable parts of the show. And it was sort of cathartic for them. And again, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but what they reflected back to me, they valued that I didn't pull any punches, but I told the story with care and with truth and authenticity, and told their story, their complete story. And it reminded me not to judge other people and their story, just to tell their story and tell it in a theatrically compelling way.
It seems to me that the both of you, and Life Jacket in particular, bit off a huge responsibility when it came to bringing this story to the public, because you have to have veracity of translation, the facts have to be right, you have to do justice. I mean, this is not like writing an historical play about somebody who's been dead for 100 years where, you can take liberties and there's no repercussions. We're talking about live people here. We're talking about the play actually happening in front of them. Their words, their personalities, their crimes being brought to the stage. I mean, it's absolutely a daunting. You must have been terrified. And my next question is something I touched on earlier, and then I want to move on to a couple other things. How did you build their trust? How did you walk into their community, describe your project, and get these folks to open up to you?
So this is Travis. It's interesting that the people who ran the village where the men were living did not want to have anything to do with us. They wouldn't return our calls. They wouldn't return our emails. But remember, I mentioned there was this pastor, and she is in her 50s, and she's made several career transitions, and this is her most recent career transition where she decided to become a pastor. And her seminary placed her in Pahokee. And she would say this, that it's not one of the plum jobs that are often offered to pastors right after seminary school. But they said, this is what we have. Would you like it? And so she decided to take it. And it was a small congregation. It had, it ranged from like several dozen on an average Sunday, but it used to have hundreds in her church before she arrived, years before she arrived. And so she wanted to shake things up. She decided to reach out to these men and invite them to her church. And then so when I called her, I made the effort, once I wasn't getting a response from the actual village, I called her. I said, I'd love to tell not only their story, but your story and why you chose to reach out to them. And the reason why she chose to reach out to them is actually pretty similar to the reason why we chose to do the story, was because it's part of humanity, and she wanted to, for faith-based reasons, to pull them in and make them part of the true community in her church. So she was eager to get that story out, and so that's why she said yes to us. And I think this was a huge factor in us being able to get so many stories and get so many people to trust us. It was because Pastor Patty Opperly, that's her name, introduced us to people in her church and people out in the sex offender community, that suddenly we had their immediate trust, because she had been there several years to that point. She was our catalyst in making a connection. And without her, the play probably wouldn't exist, or definitely wouldn't exist in its current form.
Yeah, I think that was key. And this is Anthony. I think also, Travis alluded to it earlier on with one of the initial questions. It was good that actually our research team was small, that there were the three of us going down to do these interviews, because otherwise I think it would have felt overwhelming for them, A, because it's a small town, and B, just, when we were invited to dinners that they were having at the church, right? We were able to, the three of us, sit down with each of them and get to know them, right? Informally, not as part of an interview, right? And so that helped to build kind of this relationship where when we were talking to them about difficult subjects, they were more willing to share and be open. And I think that's also part of their own process, not to put words in their mouth, but I think they would say that. Travis can correct me if he thinks otherwise, but that them telling their stories after they trusted us, them telling their stories was part of them being able to acknowledge their crimes and figure out how to move forward. So it wasn't easy, but it was. I would say it was pretty transformative in a lot of ways. So.
This is Travis. Just because of scheduling reasons, I went down a few days earlier than Anthony and one of our other research members, Amelia Printo. And so I actually, it was less intimidating because it was just me. There wasn't a team of us that parachuted in and put microphones in people's faces. So it was just me, and it was very casual at the very beginning. And actually, Pastor Patty needed to ride somewhere that was like an hour away, and so I volunteered to drive her. And so that gave me an hour with no interruptions, and just me and her in a car talking, an hour there, an hour back. But that was just a coincidence. And then it was funny, like I was telling them, in a few days, Anthony and Amelia are coming. They're like, I don't know about them. We like you, but we don't know about them. They're total strangers. I said, I was a stranger just a few days ago. And of course, once they met Anthony, once they met Amelia, then they developed immediate relationships. Sometimes they like them better than they liked me. So I think rapport is so critical, and being on the ground, and just being casual on the front end. We rented a cabin there, and we'd have folks over. We would do cookouts, and it has to grow organically. And every theater project that is qualitative in nature, that involves research, interviewing people, you just have to let the process guide itself. And the best way to let that happen is to be present, physically present, and just spend time with people. And more time is better, but it's really about the quality of the time that you're spending, not necessarily the quantity of time.
Okay, that's sounds like about 4 or 5 jobs in and of itself. Life Jacket Theater, how long has it been in existence? How did it get started?
This is Travis, we started in 2014, so we're a relatively young theater company. Fortunately, several of our shows have made an impact in New York City. And we started it to create shows that we wanted to see. We wanted to see work that was truthful, that told undertold stories of people who live on the margins, and to fuse investigative theater making style with visually compelling aesthetics. And we are tending to take a different approach with every show we do. So America's Hard to See had a interview-based approach. The previous show about the artist and author Edward Gorey had a completely different approach because Edward Gorey is no longer alive. So
I wish I had seen that. I love Edward Gorey's work.
He's fabulous. He's such an enigma. And so that's a completely different aesthetic and completely different research approach because we only had his interviews, we had his sketchbooks, we had some letters, we had some diary entries. But talk about contradictory information from a single source. That was all about comparing and contrasting one person's self-told life story. And then our next show is going back even further and trying to dig up trial transcripts of gay men who were incarcerated simply because they were gay.
Right, the Gorgeous Nothings. Yeah.
The Gorgeous Nothings. And so we love challenging ourselves with new, different research methods. But we also we never want to forget that we're telling a theatrical story. We've got to take the audience on a journey. It shouldn't feel like research. And it's kind of funny. I think there was one person who caught up with me after they saw America's Hard to See. And they said, this is a compliment. And I love docudrama and I love investigative theater, but it didn't feel like investigative or theater or a docudrama. I forgot that I was watching a play based on transcripts. Mm-hmm. And I took that as a compliment because they really wrapped up in the story. And it's funny, like, again, I never try to hide the research. And what I mean by that is the actors will step out of their roles and talk to the audience. And as sort of a theatrical vehicle in America's Hard to See, they would read our research notes. So the research notes that I wrote, that Anthony wrote, very factual. Where did the interview take place? Kind of what was the environment like, the temperature outside, very factual things to create the environment, because the aesthetic of this show was very much in the spirit of our town. So no sets, no curtains, just them, just the actors and the audience.
Wow. I want to talk about the research for a couple of moments, having done some small amount of research on my own, various projects, one of which was a play. You come across book A or testimony A, which says X happened, and you come across testimony C or book C that says, well, X didn't quite happen that way, it happened this way, and testimony G, which says something completely different. How do you reconcile all, competing, conflicting historical views? I mean, you're going into production, The Gorgeous Nothings, which I want to hear about the subject matter, but how do you sift through the historical inconsistencies?
Anthony, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think what's exciting, actually what we've tended toward, and is not trying to, is highlighting the inconsistencies, both in Gory and in America's Hard to See. We're trying to figure out, well, is the audience going to be too confused if we present these different alternate realities, actually, that may or may not have happened? With Gory in particular, right, it was interesting. He would tell some part, and you may know this being a Gory fan, he would tell some people some things about his life, and other people other things, and the things he told to these different people didn't necessarily line up, right? And then what he said in interviews didn't line up with what he said in other, there wasn't a good consistency. And in America's Hard to See, like we said, sometimes we heard stories that didn't match up with court-reported testimony. So we leaned into being open about that and leaving it to the audience to either draw a conclusion if they wanted to. But I think what's more interesting is that in both cases, the audience had to, which may not be the best. Maybe we're taking the wrong approach. Maybe audiences don't love doing this, but the audience would actually have to be okay with not knowing for sure what was the reality, and just taking in these various things that may have been the case and interpreting the characters from that perspective. So I think that's I think how we've kind of approached this. Now, we haven't had it happen yet, and we may with the Gorgeous Nothings, but we haven't had a source that, we can then discount because it's been shown to be untrue. That of course we wouldn't include a perspective that is not valid from a factual basis. But it's an interesting balance, and I think we've just tried to bring in as much of that diversity of fact in quotes that's out there, without trying to say what it means at the end of the day, because
I found audiences to be unpredictable and persnickety when they don't get all of the facts lined up neatly and presented to them. Some of them are able to deal with the natural vagueness of the obscurity of life as we know it in modern America or whatever. And other people are, this didn't make sense. And I want to know what happened here. And I don't feel like oh my gosh. But
yeah, I think this is Travis. I think we definitely experienced that with America's Hard to See, that some folks got frustrated that they didn't know what I thought as the playwright. They didn't know how I wanted them to feel about particular characters. And I had to sort of just embrace that was going to be a reaction of an audience member or some audience members, that they were going to like some of the characters in some moments and weren't going to like them in others. And it was up to them how they should feel about that. Again, that was the spirit of the play. It was wrapped up in emotional confusion.
Yeah.
And,
go ahead.
And it certainly led to, and to your point, George, it led to some confusion in some audience members where it wasn't just a cognitive confusion, like a logical confusion about X, Y, Z kind of thing, but an emotional confusion, right, for them where, I went into this thinking I was going to feel one way about this. Like I went in being like, I can't, sex offenders, I can't believe what they've done. And I went in with that attitude and I left with a different emotional confusion about how I think about sex offenders, their crimes, what we should do about them moving forward with their lives, all of these things, right? That it's, the play didn't say, hey, sex offenders aren't so bad. And it didn't say sex offenders are terrible, right? It was just a presentation of their lives. So.
Right. This is Travis. I'm less interested in cognitive confusion as a theatrical language, where you go in and you're like, I can't follow the story. Like, you never want the audience to get ahead of the story, but you don't want them to get too far behind the story. You just want to be ahead of them just a little bit. So for me, cognitive confusion happens when the play is so far ahead of you as an audience member that it's exhausting to keep up with it. Yeah, I'm not interested in that as a theater maker. But I am interested in emotional confusion, where you're following the story, you're following the characters, you're following their journey, and you're having an emotional journey, but it's a conflicting emotional journey. To me, that's really exciting.
Oh, that's valid.
Right. But some audience members find it frustrating. They want to have this nice sort of roller coaster ride that has a very slow and seamless journey from beginning to end, where it's like I'm following it along, and you have this natural arc, and everything's tied up with a nice little bow at the very end. I'm not necessarily interested in that.
That's called a blockbuster movie. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And there are plenty of amazing shows. Like there are plenty of shows that I love that follow that natural arc, whether it's the movies or Broadway shows or even off-Broadway shows. Yeah. But it's not necessarily the work that I'm interested in making.
What's wrong with making the audience think about things after they've left the theater?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because your material lends it to that. It's highly sensitive, very difficult material. And to wrap it up with a nice little bow and a chocolate on the pillow next to it is sort of a disservice. Right.
And I want the audience to feel like they're part of the research team.
Yeah.
And of course it's a truncated research process. There's a difference between spending several years on a project and spending 90 minutes watching a show. Right. But at least have sort of a sneak peek in terms of the investigative process. So that's why we embed a lot of our research notes into the script. The actors step out of role and talk to the audience and give them context they'll cite sources, and they'll give commentary in terms of helping audiences understand where this material came from.
Cool. I want to hit on one last thing, and I will let you guys go back to doing your next wonderful project. You mentioned before you had 5,000 pages of interviews, and you were writing all of this stuff up. And I have to assume that there had to have been so much good material in there. For those in the audience who are not in the choir, there's a thing called killing your darlings or killing your babies or whatever it happens to be. And that's after you've created something that you really like and you realize there's no room for it in the final project. How much of this did you have to do, and how much emotional trauma did it cause you?
Oh, dear.
Yeah,
that's a good one, huh?
A lot of pages. Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of pages. And in fact, I like to, before we go to Edinburgh, I'm going to go back through and comb through all 5,000 pages of those transcripts. Because now that we've done we've actually done several passes of the show, but now that we've had a full production and we're doing another full production, to go back and just make sure I didn't miss any true gems. So did we kill any darlings that we shouldn't have killed? But we lost several, like I mentioned, we lost several characters. And it was hard because we worked really, really to great. We invested a great deal of effort in securing some of the interviews that actually we didn't end up using. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, and even more than that, I think one of the killing darlings in fiction is like, it's kind of easy in some way. I mean, not easy, it's hard, but these were real people that we had talked to, right? And that we had developed relationships with, and whose story we thought was is a story that they had shared with us and that they put time into sharing with us and that deserved to be told. The challenge was we couldn't tell all of the stories in 90 minutes, and all of these stories just couldn't be on the stage at the same time without leading to cognitive confusion that we were talking about before for the audience in terms of tracking stories.
Sure,
so it was hard to say, gosh, this person, sitting down with this person was, for me, such a meaningful experience. I wish the audience could have that experience too, but we just can't, right? Like that story can't come out there. And it was hard. Travis was the master killer in this, but it was tough for those of us on the research team to watch them.
Did you just call him the master killer?
I know, yeah. I guess I'll own that.
There's a conversation that happens after this is over.
Yeah. So, it is. It is challenging, and it's different than writing a traditional play. The traditional play, you start with a core cast of characters, and then you start following them, and then they take you on a journey throughout the writing process. Here we have more than a cast of characters. We have a mob of characters, and we have to figure out whose journey is most interesting and how do they connect with each other to tell a cogent journey. Wow. It's challenging. Yeah, so it's a deductive process where we're cutting rather than creating.
Better you than me. I'd be weeping. Well, Travis Russ and Anthony Dvarskas of Life Jacket Theater, thank you guys so much for being here and taking the time and talking about these very, very interesting projects. Tell our audience how they can find out more about yourselves, about Life Jacket Theater, online and otherwise, please.
Sure. You can access our website at lifejackettheater.org, and that's theater with an R-E. And you can follow us on social media at LifeJacketNYC. And George, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. It's been quite an honor. Thank you for having us.
Anytime, guys. This was great. Hey kids, thanks for listening to Onstage Offstage. Onstage Offstage is produced monthly, and all of our shows can be found at onstageoffstage.org and also on iTunes. If you enjoy what we do, please recommend us to your friends. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at OnOffStage. And if you are a theater artist with an upcoming project of interest or working a part of theater we haven't covered yet, or know of someone in the theater world who'd make some great chat, please send us a note at info@onstageoffstage.org. Onstage Offstage believes in and advocates for a world where all people are free to live their lives as they wish, in peace and without fear. We believe in universal respect, diversity, and equality in all areas of life for all people, no matter what their nationality, race, religion, age, sexual status, or gender. Onstage Offstage will never promote or endorse those who seek to diminish others because of who they are. I'm George Sapio. Thank you once again, and happy theatering to all of you.